Right, so I would once again like to extend a warm welcome to everyone who is joining us today. A special word of welcome goes to our two presenters, Mrs. Sanda Futoi and Dr. Benice Lagala. My name is Sharon Tessendorf, and I'm a lecturer in the Department of Economics at Nelson Mandela University. In this webinar, we will be discussing entrepreneurship outcomes for South African youth, focusing on the period 2010 to 2020. Now, you might be wondering why so much emphasis is placed on entrepreneurship, and in particular, youth entrepreneurship. Well, the 2020 mid-year population estimates released by Statistics South Africa indicate that approximately 63% of the country's citizens are younger than 35. Concerningly, the data released by Statistics South Africa yesterday indicated that the official unemployment rate among people aged between 15 and 34 in the fourth quarter of 2020 was over 46%. And that was up from 43% in the previous quarter. Now, one might thus wonder what can be done to lower the unemployment rate amongst this group. Well, it has been argued that entrepreneurs and SMMEs present the greatest growth opportunity for our economy, and that they are a major source of desperately needed job creation. Unfortunately, when compared to other middle-income developing countries, the research suggests that the level of entrepreneurial activity among the youth, in other words, those aged younger than 35 in South Africa, is low. Today's speakers will thus provide us with a descriptive analysis of youth entrepreneurs in South Africa. They are also going to shed important light on factors affecting the entrepreneurship outcomes of South African youth and what the government is doing to enhance entrepreneurship among this vulnerable group. You can expect each speaker's address to last about 20 minutes. We will conduct a short Q&A at the end of each session. If you have any questions during the webinar, please click the Q&A icon, which appears as a question mark inside two speech bubbles. This is usually found at the top of the live stream window. Click Ask a Question and then your message before clicking the Send button. Should we not have enough time to address all of the questions that are submitted today, the speakers have indicated that they will provide emailed responses. Now, without further ado, let me introduce Ms. Futoi and Dr. Lagala. Mrs. Sanda Futoi is a lecturer in the Department of Economics at Nelson Mandela University and is currently studying towards her PhD. She previously worked as an economist at Trade and Policy Strategies and as an assistant economist at Statistics South Africa. She has experience in economic research, data production and analysis, lecturing, and academic coordination. Dr. Benice Lagala, meanwhile, completed her undergraduate degree at the University of Venda. She subsequently went on to obtain her master's degree at Howard University in the United States of America and holds a PhD in social work from the University of Pretoria. The bio that appeared in the invitation to this webinar indicates that Dr. Lagala has more than 20 years' experience in the public service sector and is an expert in social, youth, and community development affairs at national, regional, and international level. Her expertise has led to her being appointed as the Chief Director focusing on youth in the Department of Women, Youth, and People with Disabilities. What that short bio did not, however, indicate is that she also lectured at the University of Venda and is currently supervising doctoral, master's, and honours students at the University of South Africa. Dr. Flagala is also the recipient of various awards. Two notable awards include a Youth Work Award recipient for the Commonwealth Africa region and being the 2014 overall winner of the Pan-Commonwealth Youth Work Award. We will thus formally start the webinar with Ms. Fatoy. Over to you, Ms. Fatoy.
Thank you so much, Sharon. Thank you for the introductions. Thank you to Dr. Shangala for being here with us, and thank you to all the attendees. As everyone heard, Sharon only gave us about 20 minutes to do our presentations. So I decided to then pre-record my presentation. Otherwise, I could talk about the data forever and forever. I hope you will enjoy. And then I will take questions after the presentation, as Sharon has indicated. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for taking time to listen to my presentation. I will start off by indicating that my interest in this research is because South Africa has had 10 years of national youth policy, and this is a policy that is developed by the Department of Women, Youth and Persons with Disabilities. And of course, they do this in consultation with various stakeholders throughout the country. And most importantly is that this policy forms basis of strategies developed at local, provincial as well as national level towards the development of South African youth. And we also know that in the year 2020, the department drafted the latest version of the National Youth Policy, which will take us through to the year 2030. My presentation will focus on entrepreneurship outcomes for South African youth in the period 2010 to 2020. However, it is split into two parts. The first part will focus on 2020 to 2019, which is the pre-COVID-19 period. And then the second part will then focus on the year 2020, specifically looking at the two quarters, quarter 2 as well as quarter 3, or rather the months April to September, which was the time the country had a strict or hard lockdown. In this first slide, we look at growth in numbers of youth entrepreneurs over the period 2010 to 2019. And as we can see in the graphs, there has been ups and downs, but the year-on-year growth in the numbers of youth entrepreneurs averaged 1% in this period. We also see that in 2015, we had the biggest growth of 15%. And then we see that in 2013, we had the biggest negative growth of 8%. In this slide, we're looking at growth by sector from the period 2010 to 2019. And we see that the year-on-year growth in the formal sector averaged 3% compared to 1% in the informal sector. And if you compare the 2 years, 2010 and 2019, you see that the formal sector grew by 22%, whereas the informal sector grew by 7%. We now turn to age groups, and we see that the 30 to 34 years age group has the highest number of youth entrepreneurs, followed by the 25 to 29 years age group. And this has been consistent throughout the years from 2010 to 2019. When we turn now and look at age groups by sector and focusing on the year 2019, we see that the older youth who are 30 to 34 years had a higher share operating in the formal sector compared to the other groups. And those who are between 25 and 29 years old had the second highest share operating in the formal sector. We now turn to the gender dynamics of our youth entrepreneurs, and we see that in the period 2010 to 2019, the male youth entrepreneurs far exceed the numbers of female youth entrepreneurs. The gender dynamics continue to play out even when we look at gender by sector, and focusing on the year 2019, we also see that the male youth entrepreneurs had a higher share operating in the formal sector, which was 20% compared to 17% of female youth entrepreneurs operating in the formal sector. When we look at the racial demographics of our youth entrepreneurs, we see that they resemble that of the country, such that there is more of Black or African youth entrepreneurs compared to the other racial groups. So the second highest being whites, and then followed by coloreds, and then the Indians or Asian population group. When we now look at race by sector and focusing on the year 2019, it gives us a very different picture compared to the previous slide. Here we see that the white and Indian youth entrepreneurs had a higher share operating in the formal sector compared to the other racial groups. As we can see that the white youth entrepreneurs, 65% of them operate in the formal sector, and with the Indians or Asian population group, we see that 56% operate in the formal sector. And then when you look at Africans or Blacks, we see that 13% operate in the formal sector. And when we turn to colored youth entrepreneurs, we see that 27% operate in the formal sector. Turning to the education status of our youth entrepreneurs, we see that in the period 2010 to 2019, the majority of our youth entrepreneurs have less than matric. This is followed by matric, and then the third highest being tertiary, and then the smallest group have other education status. Education by sector also gives a very interesting picture for the year 2019, as we see that the youth entrepreneurs with tertiary education had a higher share of 51% operating in the formal sector, and those with less than matric had a 5% share operating in the formal sector. And when you look at matric, those with matric only, we see that they have 29% operating in the formal sector, and those who have other education status had 12% operating in the formal sector. Looking at the geographical spread of our youth entrepreneurs in the period 2010 to 2019, we see that Gauteng has had the highest number of youth entrepreneurs, followed by KwaZulu-Natal and Limpopo, and we can see that Northern Cape and Free State, as well as Northwest, have the least numbers of youth entrepreneurs. Looking at provinces by sector and focusing on the year 2019, we see that the Western Cape and the Northern Cape had a higher share of youth entrepreneurs operating in the formal sector compared to other provinces. For example, the Western Cape had 35% of their youth entrepreneurs operating in the formal sector, and the Northern Cape had 34% of their youth entrepreneurs operating in the formal sector, whereas the rest of the provinces they have less than 30% of their youth entrepreneurs operating in the formal sector. Looking at which industries attract our youth entrepreneurs also show very interesting outcomes for the period 2010 to 2019, as we see the majority of youth entrepreneurs are operating in the wholesale and retail trades industry, followed by personal services, construction, business services, manufacturing, logistics, agriculture, and we see that mining and utilities have very, very low numbers. The industry by sector and focusing on 2019 is also very, very interesting, and we see that youth entrepreneurs in business services and agriculture had a higher share operating in the formal sector compared to other industries. For example, the business services have 45% operating in the formal sector, and agriculture and related industries had 38% operating in the formal sector. We see that those operating in the mining industries 100% in the informal sector. And then also interesting is that in 2019 the utilities had no youth entrepreneurs either in the formal sector or in the informal sector. When we turn to income, which is the reward our youth entrepreneurs get for being in business, we see that between 2010 and 2018, the median monthly income of youth entrepreneurs was less than 10,000 rands, and this increased to about 11,000 rands in 2019. And focus on 2019, we see that those who are in the 75th percentile, they earn up to about 26,000 rand, and those who are in the 25th percentile, they earn up to about 4.8 thousand rands per month. Looking at incomes by sector is also a very interesting outcome. And focusing on 2019, we see that those in the formal sector earn 2 times more than those in the informal sector. For example, the median monthly income in the formal sector is about 20,000 rand, whereas in the informal sector it's about 8,000 rand. And in the formal sector, those who are in the 75th percentile earn up to 50,000 compared to 17,000 in the informal sector. And those in the 25th percentile in the formal sector earn up to 10,000 rand, whereas in the informal sector it's up to about 4,000 rand. So in this slide, we look at whether our youth entrepreneurs are creating jobs, and we can see that the majority of our youth entrepreneurs are not employing anyone, and that is the dotted line that runs from 2010 to 2019. And in the employers category, we see that many youth entrepreneurs create job opportunities for 2 to 4 employees, and we can see this in the bars, and the green bar being those who employ 2 to 4 employees. Turning to business size by sector, and business size being informed by the number of employees that our youth entrepreneurs are having, we see that in the year 2019, those employing between 10 and more people had a higher share operating in the formal sector. So if we turn to the youth entrepreneurs who are employing between 10 and 49 employees, we can see that about 85% of them are operating in the formal sector. Compared to those who are not employing anyone, we can see that only 10% of them are operating in the formal sector. So I've now concluded the first part of my presentation, and now we turn our focus to the year 2020, a year where we were faced with COVID-19 hard lockdowns or strict lockdowns, and the focus here will be on the periods April to September, or if you like, Q2 and Q3 of 2020. So in this slide, we're comparing Q1, Q2, and Q3 of the years 2019 to 2020, and we want to look at the percentage change in these quarters in terms of the numbers of youth entrepreneurs. And we can see that in Q1, before the lockdown, the number of youth entrepreneurs had increased by 7%. Whereas when we shift to Q3 and Q2, we can see that during this period of hard lockdown, the numbers of youth entrepreneurs declined. In Q2, there was a 10% decline, and in Q3, there was a 9% decline. So now we turn to look at which sector was heavily impacted, and we see that the informal sector had a 11% decline, whereas the formal sector had a 5% decline. So you can clearly see that the number of youth entrepreneurs operating in the informal sector declined more than those who are in the formal sector. When we look at impact by gender, we see that the number of female youth entrepreneurs declined more than that of males, where we see that the females declined by 12% compared to 8% decline in male youth entrepreneurs. Impact by race, we see that the number of white and colored youth entrepreneurs declined more than those of other races. For example, we see that there was a 38% decline in white youth entrepreneurs, 21% decline in colored youth entrepreneurs, 9% decline in Indian Asian youth entrepreneurs, and 6% decline in African or Black youth entrepreneurs. Looking at impact by education, we see that the number of youth entrepreneurs with less than matric and those with other education declined more than those with tertiary education, while those with matric only increased slightly by 1%. And the 87% decline in those with other education could very well be because of the very low base in the 2019 figures. The slide also shows very interesting outcomes in terms of impact by province. We see that only in 6 provinces the number of youth entrepreneurs declined, whereas the Eastern Cape, KwaZulu-Natal, and Mpumalanga increased their number of entrepreneurs during this period. The impact by industry is also very interesting. We see that the number of youth entrepreneurs declined across industries except for agricultural and related industries, which increased by 78%. And we also see a big decline in logistics, 41%, followed by business services at 24%. And I also like to note here that mining and utilities, when I did the calculation, it showed that there was over 100% increase. And this is because of the very low base in the 2019 figures, as I showed earlier on. In conclusion, I would like to note, as we saw in the first part of the presentation, that pre-COVID-19, there were improvements in entrepreneurship outcomes for South African youth, and these outcomes are influenced by age group, gender, race, education, province, sector, as well as industry. And as we saw in second part of the presentation, that COVID-19 had a negative impact on youth entrepreneurship in the country. And the most vulnerable groups are those who were hardest hit by COVID-19, and I would add, require urgent assistance. And what is comforting with these findings is that they are in line with those of other literature that I've reviewed. Based on the statistics or data that we've seen, as well as the findings that we've concluded on, I would like to highlight these 6 recommendations or way forward. Firstly is to promote entrepreneurship as a career path rather than as a last resort. This will help boost young people's intentions to become entrepreneurs. Secondly is to bridge the gender gap in youth entrepreneurship. And this is needed in order to address the gender dynamics that are visible in the entrepreneurial activities of young people. Thirdly, we need to encourage youth with tertiary education to become more engaged in entrepreneurial activities and through incentives. This will see more young people with higher education become entrepreneurs. And number 4, we need to come up with ways of offering bursaries that are targeting youth entrepreneurs. This we can do with an aim of graduating many youth entrepreneurs from the lower education status to higher qualifications. And number 5, we need to provide tailored support to those operating in the informal sector with the aim of formalization, especially now that we see the benefits of being in the formal sector. And lastly, we need to increase the participation of youth entrepreneurs in the agricultural and manufacturing sectors. And this will improve the contribution of young people in the country's economic development. So I've come to the end of my presentation. Thank you so much, Nkosi Ndiyabulela Bayedanki, and I hope that some of the information that has come out of this presentation will help us debate, research, and come up with interesting strategies, and as we implement the latest draft of the National Youth Policy that will take us through to the year 2030.
Right, thank you so much, Asanda, for that very insightful presentation. We're now going to take some of the questions that have come through during the course of your presentation. So if you're ready for them, here is the very first one that we received. The question reads as follows. You stated that whites are more likely to be involved in formal sector entrepreneurial activity than other race groups. What would you say are the main obstacles hindering the other race groups from taking up formal sector entrepreneurial activity? So that's our first question. Then our second question is, how does South Africa compare to other Sub-Saharan Africa countries in terms of types of business entities that young women are likely to be involved in? So we'll start with those two questions, and then we'll give Asanda an opportunity to respond to them, and then I will give her the next two questions.
Thank you, Sharon. Can you just repeat the second one for me so that I can just get to the last part?
The second question reads, how does South Africa compare to other Sub-Saharan Africa countries in terms of the types of business entities that young women are likely to be involved in?
Okay. Thank you so much, and thank you for the questions. I hope I don't get more tougher questions than these two. So the first one relates to the slide where we saw more white youth entrepreneurs who are who are in the informal sector compared to the other races. So I'm going to answer this question in two parts. And so I will start by saying that unfortunately in our country, when we look at or when we examine gender dynamics, we cannot escape our past. So we know that pre-1994, that races that were considered non-white were restricted and in some instances, not allowed to participate meaningfully in entrepreneurial activities. So then this, shapes the entrepreneurial culture, know-how and skills that gets passed on to the younger generation. And this also, shapes how, the younger generation picks up youth entrepreneurial activities. And the second part, I will say that if we really look at, efforts that are required for anyone who is in business to become formalized, it seems that it's much cheaper and much easier to, remain in the informal sector. So maybe in my understanding, these two could be, the reasons why we see the other races, not, moving towards, the formal sector. And the second question on the types of entities that young women get involved in, I will respond by saying that it is really not that different across countries. It is not different across continents, as we'll see that young women and, women in general who are in business, they tend to be, the majority of them tend to be in the retail sector as well as in personal services. So in that regard, I will say that, there isn't much differences. However, in our continent as well as in our country, we see that the majority are in the informal sector. Okay.
Thank you very much, Asanda. We've got another set of questions that came through. So I'm first going to take the two that I already had, and then we will respond to the two that came through during your latest set of answers. So our first question is quite lengthy, so let's read it. You stated that male youths are more likely to be involved in entrepreneurial activity than female youths. Cultural practices have traditionally imposed restrictions on women's choices and mobility. Would you consider this a disadvantage from an entrepreneurial perspective? And if so, what strategies could be applied to mitigate the effects of being restricted to working from home? So that sounds very applicable for the COVID-19 scenario as well. So just the recap, what would you consider, or would you consider it a disadvantage to work from home, and what strategies could be put in place to mitigate that? And the second question is, one of your recommendations was that youth with tertiary education should be encouraged to engage in entrepreneurial activity. What can universities, and in particular Nelson Mandela University, do to adapt their learning systems to encourage entrepreneurship? So what can we do to encourage our students to become entrepreneurs for the future?
Thanks, Sharon. The questions are becoming more difficult, but very interesting as well. So the first one relates to gender dynamics and cultural norms. And I would say yes, they have an impact. But before I answered this question, it just reminded me of a situation that happened last year with my students. And as it relates to COVID-19, learning from home and, and all of those things. So what happened is that my students had an assignment that they were supposed to, that was due. And then I got a group email saying that, they like an extension because it has become difficult to work, to study from home, because it seems like, to the parents and the grandparents, it seems that they are, trying to avoid, the house chores. And if our students, experience that, imagine what the young, female entrepreneurs who are working from home, what more do they, experience? And I think it might be very similar to what my students, were also experiencing. And in terms of strategies, I think it would then come down to how do we champion women empowerment as a society, and what are the benefits of championing women, women empowerment? And also, I wouldn't say let's try to find ways to remove women from home and try to place them somewhere. We really need to find a situation that will work for them in their homes. And as it stands, I think we just learn as we are going along. I really don't have something in mind, but broadly speaking, is that in my other research that I'm doing on youth entrepreneurship, it is becoming clear that it's not only the female youth entrepreneurs that are working from home. Both the female and the male youth entrepreneurs operate from home. So as we develop our strategies to empower them and to support them, I think we really need to take that into consideration. And it will be different, situations for different people, because not all of our homes are structured the same. Not all of our families, have the same size and backgrounds. So yeah, but it is something that really needs to be taken into consideration when we talking youth entrepreneurs. And then the second question relates to our university supporting youth entrepreneurs. And I'll start by saying that, our university, the Nelson Mandela University, does, offer support services to student entrepreneurs. And youth entrepreneurs is also one of the strategic focuses of the university. Last year, before the lockdown, there was a drive, to get or to offer more space to our student entrepreneurs so that they can operate from campus. And unfortunately, then we had the lockdown, and that was then, it didn't, go forward. But when it comes to the actual learning of entrepreneurship, and this is not only related to our university, this is related to all education institutions. For me, I think it would be great to have a curriculum or syllabi that cuts across all fields, so as to, have a wider reach and also have a wider offering to all the students in all learning institutions. Okay.
Thanks very much, Asanda. Those were very valid points and things that we, as lecturers, need to discuss more, and also hear hopefully more from the students as lockdown progressively gets lighter. We're all hoping for that. All right, so we've got 2 extra questions that have come through, and then also an interesting comment. We will I'll just read the comment first of all. This comes from one of our colleagues in the business management department. And the comment is this: entrepreneurship offered as a career path should be focused upon rather than as a last resort. And then she just says that she thinks that's very important, as many students are not going to be absorbed into the labor market, and entrepreneurship should be a first choice. I think we are all mentioning that in our classes. Don't assume you are going to get a job, because that means somebody else has got to first retire for you to get that job. We need to create jobs. So the last 2 questions are dealing with definitions. And the first one is, how is growth in the informal sector measured? And the second question is the definition of entrepreneurship as per the data enough? So this particular person is looking or wondering whether the quarterly labor force survey is giving us the definition of entrepreneurship and whether it is broad enough to capture all of our entrepreneurs in South Africa. So those are the last 2 questions we're going to take in this round before we hand over to Dr. Hlagala.
Thanks, Sharon. So I'm going to try to answer those 2 questions in one response. As it is, so the data source that I've used for my statistics, it comes from Statisa, and I've used both the QLFS as well as the LMD. And Statisa being the official statistical agency for South Africa, it gives a broader view to what's happening in our country, and they also do a very good job in publishing their methodology as well as the definitions that they use. And I know that between countries, the definitions of who is youth is very different. In South Africa, we have the definition that covers the ages 15 to 34, whereas the United Nations definition, goes up to 24. So as far as the statistics is concerned, I would say that it is representative of our country, given the methodology that is used, when collecting the data, and it's also available online. It's just to say if one is interested, but at the end of the day, it is estimates. So there will be some figures that are not, that are missed in the data.
Right, thank you, Asanda, for those comments, and I'll also just put the link into the StatsSA's general website for those who are interested in looking up some of this information. As mentioned, those are the last round of questions we're going to take before we hand over to Dr. Hlangala, but just a reminder, please keep on sending those questions through using the Q&A icon, which appears as a question mark inside the two speech bubbles, and which you'll probably find at the top of your live stream window. So right now, in light of the fact that we have had 10 years of national youth policy, which forms the basis of the work done at local, provincial and national government in support of youth entrepreneurship development, Dr. Hlangala will now respond to the points raised during Ms. Fatoy's presentation. Dr. Hlangala, the floor is all yours.
Good afternoon, colleagues. Good afternoon to all the participants. I've already been introduced, and my role is just minimal. Try and respond to some of the issues which Asanda has alluded to in her presentation. First, let me just begin by giving the context. Like the rest of the developing country, South Africa is a home for our youthful population. We know that in South Africa, when we define young people, are those ages of 14 to 35, and they constitute, more than a third of South Africa's population. And when you look at that, you compare young people, the youth population, with the population of adults as well as children, you will see that they are actually constituting more than other segment. And it is important to note that between now and 2030, at least 1 in 4 persons will be the ages of 15 to 29. It is within this context that there is a need to invest in young people and to invest in their development as well as their empowerment. And in order for us to successfully do that, there is a need to create enabling conditions, particularly for young people to be empowered. Asanda in her presentation mentioned that we already developed the National Youth Policy. The recently approved National Youth Policy was approved now in October, and it is going to be for a 10-year period ending in 2030. The youth policy prioritized 5 imperatives. First one, quality education skills and second chances, economic transformation, entrepreneurship and job creation, physical and mental health promotion, social cohesion and nation building, and effective and responsive youth development machinery. Now, if you look at the current policy and you compare it to other policies, it is the first and the only policy which actually highlights the significance of entrepreneurship as a strategy to combat high rate of youth unemployment. Hence, we are talking about economic transformation, entrepreneurship, and job creation. The past policies only spoke about economic transformation and participation, and entrepreneurship and job creation were just addressed to as by the way situation. So it means that the study which has been undertaken by Ms. Fodoi, or Asanda as I call her, is actually very, very critical, particularly in light of the high unemployment rate. Just yesterday, when Statistician General released the stats, they revealed that it is record, or it is, it is the high unemployment rate amongst young people in the past 12 years. So we can just imagine that this problem, although it has been declared as a national crisis, it is not actually getting any better. So what are actually the key interventions that we are looking at? In our national youth policy, we speak about scaling up youth employment through partnership with the private sector. And in doing that, we have actually zoomed in on the issue of supporting entrepreneurs and small businesses. So this is actually our strategy in order for us to combat high rate of youth unemployment. Now, in her presentation, Asanda alluded to the fact that year-on-year growth in the number of young entrepreneurs averaged only to 1%. So this is actually a concern. If we are saying that entrepreneurship is one of the strategies, but then we see that there is a trend where entrepreneurship remains very, very low. It is actually concerning. And this is despite the fact that entrepreneurship in South Africa is put forward as a solution to the country's rising youth unemployment rate. And then the other issue which I would like to actually allude to is that when you actually disaggregate the total early stage entrepreneurial activity, we realize that what is most notable is that entrepreneurship for South Africans aged between the ages of 25 to 34 was actually very low. But then this is actually in contrast with what Asanda has alluded to, saying that between the age groups of 30 to 34, it is actually very high. When you look at young entrepreneurs, they are actually higher in that age group. So what does this actually imply? It implies that, the problem, or many young people are not actually entering the labor market early. Hence, they are now beginning to resort to entrepreneurship. So we already also heard that, when you look into the formal sector vis-a-vis the informal sector, you find that there is a high rate of entrepreneurs, particularly within young people, or within the white racial group. You find that they are actually higher compared to those of other races, which is actually low. And then the other issue that I've noted about and commended, Asanda on is the fact that she even disaggregated her data by gender. And then when we look at the issue of gender, the number of male entrepreneurs they are actually high compared to their female counterparts. Many reasons can actually be. We know that many women or many females, they are actually hamstrung by caregiving roles. And then someone in the participants also highlighted to the issue of cultural practices, where you find that women are actually not taught to become more independent. So these are actually some of the issues which we need to really pay much more attention on. And then the other issue is the fact that the findings which reveals that majority of young entrepreneurs have less than a matric. This is actually very concerning because the vulnerability of youth in the labor market, it is exacerbated by the fact that young people are not building on their skills base through education and training. And we know that education and training is what actually underpins sustainability in terms of the enterprises. Therefore, it is important for us to note that most of young entrepreneurs actually have got less than matric. There are also the other finding which I have selected that I should actually profile is the one which actually allude to the majority of young entrepreneurs not employing anyone. I've mentioned that entrepreneurship is a strategy not for young people to only get employed themselves, but then also an opportunity for creating employment. So it is a concern to find that currently the situation remains the same. If we compare to the finding which has been revealed in our 25-year review report, it showed that in 2015, it was the same situation where you found that many young people who are running enterprises, they are actually not necessarily creating jobs, but entrepreneurship only contributes to job creation by self-employing those specific young people. So this limits the extent to which economic opportunities are generated in the economy, because then we will find that there is no job creation as a result of entrepreneurship. And I would also like to commend Asanda for her focus on the impact of COVID-19. And, she has actually raised an important issue that before lockdown, the number of young entrepreneurs had actually increased. However, there has been actually a decline in some areas. And this can actually be attributed to the restrictions. The restrictions which were actually imposed within the lockdown. And then the other finding is that the number of young entrepreneurs operating in the informal sector declined more than that of the formal sector. So it means that we need to really look at how we can strengthen the informal sector, because in order for the informal sector to be strengthened, it means that entrepreneurs within that sector need to be provided with the necessary financial and non-financial support. And then the other issue that has been raised is the number of female youth. The fact that the number of female young entrepreneurs decline compared to that of their female counterparts. So it means that when it comes to the pandemic, it has actually hit females more. Hence, you can see that female entrepreneurs, the levels have actually gone down. And finally, the other finding also revealed that the number of young entrepreneurs with less than matric and others declined more than tertiary. And this actually confirms what I said earlier about the significance of education and training in ensuring sustainable enterprises. Finally, let me conclude by saying that, you know, we are, even in government, the findings of this research and supporting the recommendations and conclusions that have actually been made. For an example, you know, we cannot discount the fact that COVID-19 actually impacted very negatively. It is on that basis that there are interventions in place to support entrepreneurs and to also support small and medium businesses. So we have seen that currently there are relief grants that are offered for entrepreneurs as well as MMEs, so that they can actually inject capital and so that they can continue with their. Then again, the fact that many vulnerable groups are those that have actually been hit the most. Youth with disabilities, young women, these are the most affected. But then again, you must also look at young people who come from rural areas. They have actually been hit even more. So these are some of the things that need to actually inform strategies which we need to have on board when we design the interventions. So these findings actually support the findings which have been conducted by earlier studies. But then the most important recommendation of promoting entrepreneurship as a career path, I think that is actually, you know, one of the critical areas. And in government, we are even advocating for entrepreneurship education from lower primary levels, so that our young people can from an early age become well-versed in entrepreneurship, but then they can also study not only to seek for jobs, but then they can actually study in order to employ themselves and also to create jobs for others. And then finally, the issue of bridging gender gap in youth entrepreneurship is very critical and requires that we need to start our interventions from home, where we encourage young girls to be independent, where we actually instill in them a sense of confidence so that they can be able to know that they can stand on their own. And then encouraging youth entrepreneurship within tertiary education. I've already alluded to the fact that it needs not, we don't need to actually start only in tertiary education, but then we need to start as far back as in primary education. And then there was also a finding which talks about offering bursaries and also tailored support for young entrepreneurs. This is critical. When we look at support, we must look at not only financial support, but then we need to make sure that we look at non-financial support. That is why, you know, having mentors who have actually made it is very critical. We need to make sure that there are mentors in order for the enterprises to be sustained. And then the final finding that I mean recommendation which has been made is increasing participation of young entrepreneurs in agricultural and manufacturing sector. Just yesterday, I was participating in a meeting with our portfolio committee, our parliamentarians, and one of the things that they mentioned and emphasized was the need for us as government to ensure that we attract and recruit and retain young people in the value chain of agriculture. So that is very significant, and we must acknowledge that we cannot be able to do it on our own, but we can do it if we are working together with young people themselves. We can do it if we are working together with the private sector, civil society sector, and most importantly, with our institutions of higher learning. Thanks, Chairperson. I think let me pause right there. Thank you.
Now, we've already got a number of questions that are stemming from your presentation. I am going to share them one by one to ensure that we have adequate time to have the information going through to Dr. Hlagala. We are on various platforms to ensure that Dr. Hlagala can join us today. So the first question is this one. Previously, the National Youth Policy was for 5 years. Why is the latest National Youth Policy indicating that it is going to be in existence for 10 years? What informed that change? So that first question that we're posing to Dr. Hlagala is this one. Previously, the National Youth Policy was set for 5 years. The newest version will be running for 10 years. What has informed that change? So over to you, Dr. Hlagala.
Thanks, Sharon. We are having now the third National Youth Policy. Just a second. We are having the third National Youth Policy. And the first National Youth Policy was for 5 years, the second one 5 years. And indeed, this is the first National Youth Policy, which is for 10-year period. What informed it? As you are aware that when we were actually developing the National Youth Policy, there were extensive consultations with young people, with experts in the youth field, but then also with the general South African stakeholders. And the reason for expanding the number of years is because we have realized that 5-year period is very short. By the time the 5 years lapse, you find now that we have to review the policy. And if you look at the first and the second youth policy, not much is actually changing in terms of policy priorities. So we actually needed adequate time for us as government to monitor implementation. So it is for that reason that we actually expanded the period for 10 years. But then it is important for participants to note that even though the policy is for 10 years, we are currently developing an integrated youth development strategy, which is going to be for 5-year period. And over and above that, on annual basis, we will have an annual plan of action to assist in checking implementation of the National Youth Policy. So we are not going to be waiting for 10 years in order for us to insert other new issues that can actually emerge. We will make sure that our strategy actually address such issues. We wanted to give ourselves adequate time for implementation.
Thank you very much, Hlagala, for that response. It makes a lot of sense to me. I do have some background in development economics as well, and we know that just having a new plan every 5 years doesn't necessarily solve the problem. Right, then our second question is this one. You've mentioned that government wants our entrepreneurs to succeed. Is government working with the private sector to enhance our youth's entrepreneurial skills? And can you mention any of those examples? So the question again, is this: is government working with the private sector to enhance entrepreneurial skills? And can you give us any of those, any example where the private sector is partnering with government?
Currently, we have got the National Youth Development Agency, which is responsible for implementation. And then we also have got other government departments that are responsible for implementation of programs and are indeed supporting young entrepreneurs. So I was saying that the National Youth Development Agency currently is working with the private sector in an initiative called the Maramento program, which is actually responsible for supporting young entrepreneurs. And then you will find that seasoned entrepreneurs, emerging young people who are entrepreneurs, they are actually allocated a mentor as a means to support them to ensure that their businesses are actually sustainable.
Right, thank you so much, Dr. Hlagala. Those are very important points which you've shared with us. And I think all of our attendees will have taken note of those points which you've shared. And for those who are considering being entrepreneurs in the rest of this year, will now also be aware of the various strategies that are available to assist them. Unfortunately, time has caught up with us. So before we sign off, I would, however, like to ask our presenters whether there is anything else that they would like to share with the attendees before we wrap up. Asanda, anything from your side?
Hi, Sharon. Thanks again. Nothing on my side, because Dr. Hlangala's response was comprehensive, and it also gave us an idea of what they're doing in government and also in partnership with, the private sector, as well as, what their plans are for the next 10 years. It's also very comforting that even though the National Youth Policy is, laid out for 10 years, but there will be mid-term strategies chances to review the strategies rather, and improve as we go along. And I really thank her response, and I thank everyone for attending, and I also thank you, Sharon, for facilitating this session. So I'll just give Dr. Hlangala the last word. Thank you.
Thanks, Asanda and your team. I think I just want to really appreciate the opportunity of participating, but then I would really like to thank you for this most important and valuable study which you have actually shared with us. We look forward to receiving your report and sharing it with government. And from my side, I undertake to create an opportunity for you to come and make a presentation. Also to players, I think we have got a forum where there are provincial youth focal points, as well as those that are in at national level. So I will create an opportunity for you to come and make a presentation, so that the study is not only an academic exercise, something that can help inform the interventions that are in place. But then let me thank all the participants as well, for the thought-provoking questions, and then urge you to continue engaging us as government, and then invite us to your forum. Maybe there is a need for you to want to understand and know about either the programs and policies which are run by government. We are at your service, and then always willing to have engagement with yourselves. And then on the issue of promoting agriculture and entrepreneurship, I would like to just conclude by saying that young people, particularly those who are in tertiary education, they must see themselves as instruments of change in their communities. Our communities really need you. I think we need to do away with the fact that during school holidays, or you'll find that tertiary young students, they are not playing any active role in their communities. I want to urge you that volunteer your services, but then also become involved in at least just mentoring few young people. Old as I am, I don't look old, but I am. As I am actually involved even in mentorship. I mentor young girls, I mentor even students. So, I urge you to also become involved and at least just do one volunteer service. It will certainly change someone's life. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Sanda and Dr. Hlagala. Those words of wisdom in particular that Dr. Hlagala shared with us at the end, I know Prof. Mishi, for one, agrees with you. We recorded a welcome for our first year students, and in his comments, he emphasized how important it is to give back to society. So thank you very much for those insightful words. In closing, I would once again like to thank our speakers for sharing their insight with us. To everyone who has attended today's event, thank you for joining us. We appreciate you signing in and hope you have gained valuable insight into the relationships and differences between youths engaged in entrepreneurial activity in South Africa, as well as learning more about what the government and the private sector are doing to assist our entrepreneurs.